Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Go Beyond. My name is Alyssa Robinson. I am the digital strategist here at Trietsch, and I am here with our senior pastor, Reverend Daniel Humbert, and we are going to be digging into James chapter 3 today. So I'm really excited about that. We are in the middle of our worship series, Faith Works, where we are talking about the book of James and the importance of faith and works coming together. And this week is all about controlling our mouths, which I'm sure anyone listening who knows me at all is going to say, Alyssa, you need to practice what you preach today and control your mouth a little bit more. And we can have a side conversation about that later.
Yeah.
But my first question, this does not seem to be the first place in scripture that we hear about controlling our mouths and the tongue being the root of a lot of evil thoughts and actions. And so how many places in the Bible does it specifically talk about controlling our tongues?
Yeah, I don't know an exact count because it really kind of depends on what translation you're reading and all that kind of stuff. But I can tell you that in the Old Testament, the wisdom literature like Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Solomon has a lot of this, and particularly Proverbs and Psalms. And so, I mean, it's probably in there 10 or 20 times between those books. And they all speak into that whole issue of, hey, watch what you say. I mean, build up, encourage, be wise about how you speak and not speak into evil. They use a lot of distinction between good and evil in terms of what we speak and how we speak. But then, of course, as I referenced in the message, I mean, Jesus says it a few times, and one of my favorites was that passage out of Luke, where he just said, what you say flows from what's in your heart. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? Particularly when we get to typing on social media or speaking in a conversation, it's when our kind of regulator or our filter is off, that's what's coming right out of our heart, right? And so if we speak some nasty stuff or mean stuff or vicious stuff, that's coming right out of our heart. And likewise, if we're being kind and gracious and building up in our speech, then we're kind of speaking straight out of the heart. So in the Old Testament, it's primarily out of the wisdom literature, though some would say and argue that there are a few passages out of the Torah, the law, the first 5 books, that kind of address how we present ourselves and how we talk. But then it's Jesus, James, and Paul, and the 3 bigwigs of the New Testament, and they just say it very clearly. This is a part of who we are. Watch what you say. And it's much more about our attitude and our thoughts than it is about cussing. I mean, we probably ought to work on our cussing. I know I should, but it's really not so much about cussing as it is about, how you're presenting yourself and how you're representing God and how you're treating other people with your words.
Yeah, the cussing thing. I'm the first to admit, I curse like a sailor. I really try. Honestly, I don't even try and change it. But I do have my limits on it's the way you talk to people. It's the way you treat people. I might, let an expletive fly about a situation that I'm in or to emphasize a point, but I would never direct that at an individual. And I'm wondering where is the line? Because a lot of times when I'm going to my mom, as an example, and I say, I just need to vent to you for a moment. I just need to let something out. I need to get it out. I know that it's also bad for our health to bottle things up.
Right.
But I could be going to her and speaking evil to her in a moment, saying, I just need to get this out to somebody. Is that a bad thing to do?
Well, so yeah, no, I think I don't know that James really had this concept in mind about sort of mental health and needing to process, right? And that's what you're talking about, is processing information. And so or not information, but what you're going through and what you're experiencing. And so I don't really think that's what James is talking about. James is really talking about how we interface with each other and how we interact with one another, not so much like with a counselor, whether a professional counselor or a good guide like your mom or a mentor or a coach or whatever, where you're literally just processing something out. Every once in a while, we do need to speak into, man, that really hurt my feelings, or that's really evil, or that's not the way it ought to be. And to process that out is one thing with a confidant versus just sort of treating somebody poorly. Because when all is said and done, that's what James is really addressing here, is treating one another poorly.
Well, and one of the things that you talked about on Sunday is, a kind of tale as old as time. It is not new that we are mistreating each other, that we are not speaking respectfully to each other. And so I just want to know culturally, do you know what James was specifically responding to when he was putting so much emphasis on speech? Like, what was going on with that first church that
Yeah.
he's helping build?
Well, as we've mentioned actually each week, I mean, it is fascinating that James is addressing these things just 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death, right? So again, within a generation, whatever he's covering, he's talking about a very early set of circumstances in the life of the church. And here's one of them. And while I don't know that any of us knows exactly what he's addressing, it appears based on in chapter 4, verse 1, that he's actually addressing a controversy or a conflict or some turmoil in the local churches, and he's trying to help them figure out a way to process through that. So they were dealing with anger, right? They're at each other's throats, if you will, or they're disagreeing over something. And then he's going another step further and talking about, well, look, so when you're angry or when you're in a dispute, let's not trash each other. Let's not disparage one another. Let's not talk down to one another. Let's be respectful. I mean, let's recognize how important it is to maintain not only decorum, but also just common courtesy and respect and integrity about how I speak to you. Um, I know I've got a teenager. I've had two teenagers now, and so every once in a while you have to have this conversation. I don't doubt for a second that your parents had this conversation with you at some point as an adolescent. Hey, watch your tone, or watch the way you present this, right? And it wasn't so much not necessarily even the words you said, but it was the way we presented it or the way we convey it, right? And
Yeah,
so,
my phrase was check your attitude. That's which I still hear from time to time.
that's what James was dealing with. He was dealing with people who hadn't figured out how to check their attitude when they were trying to rectify a problem or figure out how to make the church work better. They just started going at each other's throats. And so we've said this every week, and I'll say it again. There's nothing new under the sun. What we're experiencing today is not uncommon from what James was talking about, whether it's in the life of a church or the life of a country or the life of the world. We deal with this all the time. It's our human condition.
Well, and at the end of chapter 3, he starts talking about two kinds of wisdom. So he talks about living into God's wisdom and not into the world's wisdom. And how do we gut check differentiating the two? How do we know that it's God's wisdom versus the world's wisdom? And I just find it interesting that he calls both of them wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, and he pushes that even into chapter 4, and so we might address that a little bit more next week too. But he's basically again in the context of speech, he's saying, sometimes we will literally claim the goodness of God in one sentence and curse a creation of God in another sentence, right? And so part of what he's acknowledging is we can't be two-faced. I mean, that's not really his language, but we can't sort of say God is great and wonderful, but something that God created, i.e., you or somebody else, when I'm in conversation with you and just say you're a sorry dog and you're no good and what you've thought. And essentially that's James's balancing act or threshold that you're talking about, is if we begin to disparage or call out a creation of God, somebody who's made in the image of God, that's kind of the threshold. And we're all tempted to do it. I mean, holy crud, I do it all the time, right? Where if I don't like what somebody's doing, or if I certainly don't necessarily like the person, it's very easy to villainize or to sort of make evil this other person. And that's what James is cautioning us against, because once we cross that line, whatever it is, man, it's easy to keep trashing, right? It's easy to keep dogging. And so James is just saying, sort of keep that in check. And so in our modern language, that's why I love that poster that I found at those schools. None of that was original with me. That was something that we're trying to teach our kids in elementary and middle and high school, that golly, we adults need to consider as well. Think, right? Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And then is it kind? And that might be an easy threshold. I know sometimes that might be a little overwhelming to try to do that in an instant. But just golly, even one or two of those. Is this going to be kind, what I'm saying? Or will this be helpful in the conversation? Or is it just sort of a gotcha zinger kind of a deal, right? And we could all stop right there just in the instant and go, okay, pause, breathe, hold on. Is this kind? Is this generous? And I would also say, just because it's needs to be kind and inspiring does not mean it shouldn't be challenging or it shouldn't be cautionary in how I talk with somebody, right? We can have these disagreements without being ungracious and unkind. And I think that's what James is cautioning us about.
Yeah, and one of the things that I struggle with, and I actually have a few questions on this already mapped out for Wednesday, uh, but we have different opinions on what is helpful, what
Yeah,
is necessary, what is inspiring, and something
absolutely.
that you think is necessary, I might not. And so I that's where I start to struggle is man, at what how do we hold each other accountable, or is that even our role to do that?
Well, yeah. So, as you rightfully point out, so if I say something that I believe is necessary, but you find quite unnecessary, that's where we just enter into further dialogue, right? We further talk through, well, golly, why did you even say that? Or what did you mean by that? Or how does that work? And that's where this is a whole nother topic, but that's where curiosity comes in, right? Well, I wonder what you meant by that. And I'm wondering what you tried to intend by that part of the conversation, right? Curiosity can make a huge difference. And that typically curiosity is not accusatory, it's just open ended. And I'm trying to figure this stuff out. And I think it can be helpful in the conversation.
So that might be a helpful thing. And I don't know if James is going to talk about that later. Maybe we should be reading chapter 4 and chapter 5.
Yeah.
But it does feel like um, listening that we talked about last week, and also this week talking about controlling our mouths, a lot of it is based in don't make assumptions. And that leads to the curiosity. Don't make assumptions about what the person meant when they said this, or what they were thinking when they did this, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I would agree. And it also goes to respect, right? I want to respect you as a person. Again, that does not mean I necessarily agree or affirm, but it does mean I respect you. And so if I can maintain that respect, it helps in the conversation. And that's where I think what James was pointing out at your last question about wisdom. I just think that's a huge component, right? So part of what gets us in trouble, I'll only speak for me, but a part of what gets me in trouble is when I know something, I know X or Y or Z, and that's knowledge. Knowledge is very helpful, but sometimes knowledge can get us in trouble, right? And then that's the sort of the difference between wisdom and knowledge is wisdom says, okay, I know this information, but how should I share it? Should I share it? Can I share it? Those are questions of wisdom versus just, well, I know this is the way it is, or I know this information. Sometimes that's why wisdom can be helpful. And wisdom, I believe, never comes instantly, whereas knowledge can. I can read something and learn it. Whereas wisdom is, well, what do I do with that? What do I do about that? What is that all for? What's that about? Wisdom comes in time. And I know obviously in a conversation, we don't always have a lot of time, but maybe we need to invest at least a little more time in the conversations so that we can use wisdom. And I think that's ultimately what James is trying to point out.
All right. Well, that's about all that we have time for today. So thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Go Beyond. You can catch all previous episodes at tmumc.org/go beyond. And on Wednesday, we are going to dig in even more, challenge this. And I already started challenging a little bit today because it's what I do.
Do
So, so we will see you again on Wednesday at 12:30. And I hope that you have a good week until then.
Thanks, y'all.